Hello there. Tonight, we'll spend a quiet evening with the monks of medieval France, the patient brothers of the Benedictine and Cistercian abbeys, who, over the long, slow centuries, gave us champagne and cheese. It's a story that unfolds across cool stone cellars and hillside vineyards, in abbeys where the day was measured in bells and the work of the hands was a kind of prayer. We'll follow how careful hands, season after season, turned grape juice into something that sparkled, and milk into something that kept through the winter. Oh, and by the way, if you're tired of scrolling for ages just to find something to fall asleep to, we made an app for that. It's called Tonight. The more you listen, the more it learns the kind of stories you like. So there's always one waiting that feels right for you. Nothing to scroll, nothing to decide. Just pick your favorite voice, set a timer, and drift off. It's a free download. The link's just below this video. Before we get started, take a few moments to get cozy and comfortable. Allow your muscles to relax. Soften your shoulders. Let your hands rest. Take a deep breath in. Across the long centuries between the fall of Rome and the dawn of the modern world, a great deal of European farming and cookery was quietly worked out behind monastery walls. The cheese on a French market table, the bottle of champagne in a Paris cellar, the dark beer in a Belgian glass, the green and yellow liqueurs of the Alps. Many of these have their roots in the slow, patient work of monks and nuns in stone abbeys scattered across the countryside. Over a span of roughly 1,000 years, it is a quiet story, and a long one. There are no battles in it, and very little drama. There are vineyards on south-facing slopes, and copper kettles in cool cellars, and herb gardens in cloister courtyards. There are men and women in plain robes, going about the small, repeated tasks of the day, and writing down what worked. That, in the end, is how many of the foods and drinks the world now thinks of as deeply national. French, Belgian, Italian, German came into being. Tonight is the story of how that happened. To understand how monks came to make cheese and champagne, it helps to begin with a single small book, written in the 6th century in a hilltop monastery in central Italy. The book was the Rule of Saint Benedict. Its author, a quiet Italian abbot, had no intention of inventing anything to drink. He simply wanted to set down a workable plan for how a community of monks should live together. The rule was modest in its ambitions. It called for a balanced day, divided between prayer, reading, and manual labor. The often quoted summary of it, in Latin, was ora et labora, pray and work. The work part was not optional. Benedict thought idleness was bad for the soul, and he thought a community ought to feed itself by its own hands, rather than depend on the charity of others. Over the centuries that followed, that simple idea spread across Western Europe. Benedictine houses were founded in France, in what is now Germany, in England, in northern Italy, in Spain. Later reform movements within the same tradition, Cistercians, the Carthusians, the Trappists, pushed the idea of self-sufficiency even further. New abbeys were established in remote valleys and on cleared forest land, often on poor soil that no one else wanted. The monks drained marshes, terraced hillsides, dug ponds for fish, planted orchards, and slowly turned wilderness into farmland. Self-sufficiency meant that an abbey had to produce, more or less, everything its community needed. Grain for bread, vegetables for the kitchen, wine or beer for the table, milk and so cheese, honey from the bees, wax for candles, cloth, leather, ink, parchment. The list went on. A large abbey could be, in effect, a small village, a self-contained economy with workshops, dairies, mills, breweries, and gardens spread around the church at its center. And monasteries had three rare advantages in their long centuries of work. They had time. The same community lived in the same buildings, doing the same tasks for generation after generation, with very little change. They had record keeping. Monks were among the few people in early medieval Europe who could read and write fluently, and they wrote things down. Recipes, observations, accounts, weather notes, and they had patience. Methods that required years of slow attention. The aging of a cheese, the maturing of a barrel of wine, the careful selection of a herd over decades, fitted naturally into a way of life that was already measured in years and centuries, rather than days. These were exactly the conditions, as it turned out, under which good food and good drink are invented. Of all the things made in medieval European monasteries, cheese was perhaps the most ordinary and the most quietly important. Almost every abbey had a herd of some kind. In the north, cows. In the hills, goats. In Spain and parts of Italy, sheep. Where there were animals, there was milk. And where there was milk, there was the old problem of what to do with it before it spoiled. Cheese was already an ancient food when the monasteries began making it. The Romans had made cheese. So had the Celts and the Germanic peoples beyond the Roman frontier. What the monks contributed was not the invention of cheese itself, but something almost as important: the long, patient refinement of dozens of regional varieties, and the careful, written passing on of methods from one generation to the next. A great many cheeses that today carry the name of a French village or a Belgian abbey were first made, in something close to their modern form, by monks. In the Vosges mountains of eastern France, Irish monks who had settled at the Abbey of Munster, the name itself comes from the Latin monasterium, meaning monastery, gave their name to the strong, soft, orange-rinded cheese still made in those hills. In northern France, the Abbey of Marwal gave its name to Marwal cheese, a square, washed-rind cheese that was already well known by the 10th century. In Normandy, The monks of the Abbey of Pont-l'Evêque were associated with the soft, square cheese, now called by the same name. In the Jura Mountains of what is now Switzerland, the monks of the Abbey of Bellelay developed in the medieval period a hard cheese now known as tête de moine, monk's head, which is still made today and is traditionally served shaved into delicate, thin rosettes. In northern Italy, Cistercian monks at the Abbey of Chiaravalle, near Milan, are credited with the early development of the hard aging cheese, now called Grana Padano, closely related to Parmesan. Across the Alps, in Austria and southern Germany, similar abbeys produced their own local cheeses, each shaped by the particular grasses, herds, and weather of its valley. In the Loire Valley, in Burgundy, in the Pyrenees, similar stories played out, abbey by abbey, century by century. Later, after the French Revolution scattered the original monks, the Trappists in particular kept up the cheese-making tradition. Port Salut, made first by Trappists in Mayenne, in western France, in the early 19th century, became one of the best-known French table cheeses. In Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Quebec, Trappist cheeses are still made today, sold quietly from the gatehouses of working abbeys. To understand how this could go on so steadily for so long, it is worth walking slowly through what cheese-making in a monastic dairy actually looked like. It began, of course, with the morning milking. In a typical abbey dairy, a small number of lay brothers, monks who had taken a simpler set of vows and did much of the heavier outdoor work, would bring the cows in at first light. The milk was poured, still warm, into wide wooden or copper vessels and carried into a cool stone room set aside for the purpose. This room was the dairy, and it was often built against the north wall of the cloister, where the sun never reached and the temperature stayed even all year round. The first step was to warm the milk gently. In a great copper pot set over a low fire or a bed of warm ashes, the milk was brought up to a particular temperature, warm to the hand, but not hot. The dairyman, who in a monastic setting was often a particular brother who had spent his whole adult life at the work, judged the temperature by feel. Next came the addition of the starter. A small portion of slightly soured milk from the previous day, or a measure of whey kept aside, was stirred into the warm milk. This brought in the harmless bacteria that would, over the coming hours, begin to thicken the milk and develop its flavor. After the starter came the rennet. Rennet, an extract from the stomach lining of a young calf, contained an enzyme that caused milk to set into a soft curd. A small amount was stirred in, and then the milk was left perfectly still for an hour or so. During that hour, in the cool dairy, the milk slowly thickened from a liquid into a soft, pale jelly. When the curd had set, the dairyman cut it. With a long, flat blade, or a wooden frame strung with wire, he sliced the curd into small, even cubes, the size of a pea for hard cheeses. The the size of a walnut for soft ones. The smaller the cubes, the more whey would drain, and the harder and drier the finished cheese would be. This single choice, made at this single moment, did much to decide what the cheese would eventually become. The cut curds were then stirred, gently, for a long time. As they were stirred, they shrank and firmed, and the pale yellow whey separated and rose around them. The whey was drained off, often kept for the pigs, or for making the next day's starter, and the curds were lifted out, by hand or in a cloth, and pressed into wooden molds. The shape of the mold and the weight of the press decided much of the rest. A small round mold with little pressure gave a soft cheese like Munster or Pont l'Evêque. A larger round mold with a heavy stone on top gave a hard wheel that might keep for a year or more. A square mold, lined with a cloth, gave the flat blocks of the northern French abbey cheeses. Once shaped, the young cheeses were salted. Salt drew out the last of the whey, slowed the wrong sorts of microbes, and began to form the rind. Some cheeses were rubbed with dry salt by hand. Others were floated for a day or two in a tub of strong brine. Then they were carried down into the aging cellar. The aging cellar was the patient heart of the whole operation. Cut into the rock beneath the abbey, or built with thick stone walls in a north-facing courtyard, it stayed cool and damp all year round. The young cheeses were laid out on wooden shelves, and there they were turned, day after day, week after week, month after month. Some were brushed with brine, some were rubbed with beer, or wine, or local spirits. And it was this washing that gave the deep orange color and the strong smell to washed rind cheeses like the ones of Munster and Marwal. Some were simply left to grow whatever rind the cellar air gave them. The slow aging was not, in any deep sense, understood. The brothers who tended the cellar knew what worked. They knew which shelf, in which corner, gave the best result. They knew the time of year when the milk was richest, and which cellars in the abbey gave which kinds of rind. They wrote some of this down. Much of it they simply passed on, from one cellarer to the next, by showing. A wheel of hard cheese might stay in that cellar for a year, or 2, or 3, before it was finally judged ready. A soft cheese might be ready in 6 weeks, and then it was brought up, wrapped in cloth or paper, and sent out. To the abbey table, to the local market, to the kitchen of a passing pilgrim, to a distant patron. This was the work of thousands of small dairies in thousands of abbeys across many centuries. It is not a dramatic story. It is the same morning, repeated, with very small variations, for a very long time. Out of that quiet repetition came most of the cheeses that the world now knows. If cheese was the most ordinary of the monastic foods, sparkling wine was perhaps the most surprising. And here we come to one of the great, half-true stories of European food history. The story of Dom Perignon. In the second half of the 17th century, in a Benedictine abbey called Auvilliers, on a chalky hillside above the river Marne in the Champagne region of northeastern France, the cellar master was a monk named Pierre Perignon. Dom was the customary form of address for a senior Benedictine monk. He held the post of cellar master for nearly 50 years, from his arrival as a young man in the late 1660s until his death in 1715. His job, in plain terms, was to make wine. The abbey owned vineyards on the slopes around Auvilliers, and the wines of Champagne, at that point, were mostly still wines, not sparkling, and were known for being thin, sharp, and difficult. The cold, northern climate often stopped the fermentation of the wine before all the sugar had turned to alcohol. The wine, bottled in spring, would sometimes start fermenting again as the weather warmed. The result was bubbles in the bottle, foam when it was opened, and a great many broken bottles in the cellar from the pressure. For most of the 17th century, this was considered a problem. Dom Perignon spent his long career trying to make the wine of his abbey as good as possible. He was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily careful man. He paid close attention to which slopes produced the best grapes and which years gave the best wine. He pioneered the practice of pressing the grapes very gently so that even red grapes gave a pale juice that could be made into a clear, light wine. He blended grapes from different vineyards to balance flavors. He insisted on using stronger glass bottles from England, which could hold the pressure of fermenting wine without bursting. The popular legend has it that Dom Perignon invented champagne, that he tasted the bubbles for the first time and cried out in delight that he was drinking stars. That particular line is almost certainly a later invention, written down long after he was dead. The truth is a little less neat and rather more interesting. He did not invent the bubbles. The bubbles had been there for as long as the champagne wines had been made in cold cellars. What he did was something more useful. Over his long life of patient work, he greatly improved the quality of the still wine of the region. And the techniques he refined, the careful pressing, the blending, the stronger bottles, the attention to which vineyard gave which character, became the foundation on which the deliberate making of sparkling champagne was built in the 18th and 19th centuries by others. The systematic French production of champagne as we know it, with the slow second fermentation in the bottle and the careful work of removing the sediment, took shape gradually over more than a century at at the great houses of Rans and Épernay. But the Abbey of Auvilliers was at the heart of the early story. And when the firm of Mohiti bought the Abbey vineyards in the 19th century, after the French Revolution had dissolved the monastery itself, they kept the name of the old cellar master alive. The bottle of Dom Perignon that one might see today in a fine restaurant carries, in a small way, the memory of a careful Benedictine monk who spent 50 years tending vines on the chalky slopes above the Marne. While the French monks of Champagne were quietly working on their wine, the monks of the Low Countries and the German lands were quietly working on their beer. Brewing in monasteries went back nearly as far as the monasteries themselves. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed each monk a modest daily ration, about half a pint of wine, or, in regions where wine did not grow well, an equivalent amount of beer. In northern France, in Belgium, in the German lands, in England, beer was the everyday drink of the monastery table. The water of the time was often unsafe. The boiling involved in brewing made beer reliably drinkable. A weak table beer, brewed for general consumption, was a basic provision of every northern abbey. In the medieval period, the great Belgian and German abbeys built up considerable expertise. They grew their own barley. They cultivated hops in their gardens. Once the use of hops as a flavoring and preservative had spread north from the Rhine in the early Middle Ages. They built proper brew houses with great copper kettles and long cooling vessels and underground cellars for storage. In Bavaria, the Benedictine tradition of brewing was older still, and on a larger scale. The brewery at the Abbey of Weihenstephan, on a low hill north of Munich, dates its commercial brewing to the year 1040, and is often cited as the oldest brewery still in continuous operation in the world. Other Bavarian Benedictine houses, Andechs, Weltenberg, Ettal, kept their breweries running through the Reformation and the secularization of the early 19th century. And many of them still produce beer today. On the same hilltops where the first monks brewed nearly 1,000 years ago. After the French Revolution scattered most of the old monastic brewing houses, the tradition was kept alive in the Low Countries and eventually revived by the Trappists. The Trappists are a reformed branch of the Cistercian order, themselves a reformed branch of the Benedictines. Each reform a return to a stricter and quieter life of work and prayer. In the 19th century, the Trappists refounded abbeys in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. And a number of them set up small breweries to support their communities. The Belgian Trappist beers are perhaps the best known. The Abbey of Chimay, in the hills of southern Belgium, began brewing again in 1862. The abbeys of Orval, Rochefort, Vestmaal, and Westvleteren followed in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Each developed its own particular style. Dark, strong, complex beers, fermented twice, conditioned slowly, sold in small numbers from the Abbey gatehouse and in a limited number of cafes and shops. The brewing was, and still is, done quietly. The beer is brewed within the walls by, or under the supervision of, the monks themselves. The proceeds support the community and its charitable works. The breweries are small. The output is small. And the methods, the long secondary fermentation, the bottle conditioning, the patient aging, are recognizably descended from the slow, careful approach of the medieval cellars. A glass of Trappist beer today, poured carefully into a wide, bold goblet, is in a real sense a glass of medieval Europe. Not exactly as it was, but along an unbroken line of practice that runs back, by way of a long, quiet chain of brewers in plain robes, to the first northern abbeys. If cheese was for the table and beer for the day, then the great monastic liqueurs were for the very end of the meal, or for medicine, or for both. The most famous of them are chartreuse and Benedictine. Chartreuse takes its name from the great Carthusian monastery of the Grande Chartreuse, set in a fold of the French Alps north of Grenoble. The Carthusians are an unusually quiet order, even by monastic standards. Each monk lives alone in a small cottage along the cloister, coming together with the others only for the longer services of the day, and for one shared meal each Sunday. The rest of the week is spent in solitude, in prayer, in reading, in tending a small garden, in handwork. The story of the liqueur begins, by tradition, in 1605, when a manuscript was given to the Carthusians of Paris by a French nobleman. The manuscript was a recipe, long, complicated, and made up of a great number of plants, for what was called an elixir of long life. The Carthusians kept the manuscript. They studied it. And in the early 18th century, the apothecary brother at the Grande Chartreuse began, at last, to make the elixir. It was a difficult recipe. It called for about 130 different herbs, flowers, leaves, roots, and barks, gathered from the meadows and slopes of the surrounding Alps, dried, ground, and steeped in wine spirit, then distilled, then steeped again with another set of plants, then aged in oak barrels in cool cellars. The exact list of plants and the exact order of the steps was kept secret. To this day, it is known only to a small number of monks in the order. The original elixir was bitter and very strong, meant as a medicine, taken by the spoonful. Over the years, sweeter versions were made for general drinking. The green chartreuse, deep grass green and high in alcohol, came first. The milder yellow chartreuse, gentler and sweeter, came later in the 19th century. Both are still made today by a small number of Carthusian brothers in a quiet distillery in the valley below the monastery. Benedictine has a similar shape of story, though it is not quite as old as it claims. The liqueur is sold in a square bottle with the letters D-O-M on the label, standing for the Latin Deo Optimo Maximo, to God, most good, most great, an old monastic dedication. It was first made and marketed in the 19th century in the Norman town of Fécamp by a local wine merchant who said he had found an old recipe in the library of the town's ruined Benedictine abbey. Whether the recipe really came from the monks, or whether the merchant had simply put together a charming story to sell his drink, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the abbey itself had, for centuries, been a working Benedictine house with its own gardens of herbs, and that the practice of distilling complex herbal liqueurs in such abbeys was well established. Across Europe, a number of other monastic liqueurs were made in similar ways. The Trappists made fruit liqueurs and herbal aperitifs in several of their abbeys. German Benedictine houses made bitter digestives. Italian monasteries made amari, the family of bitter herbal drinks, still common at the end of a long Italian meal. What all these had in common was the slow knowledge of the monastery herb garden, a knowledge built up across many quiet centuries, plant by plant, season by season. Wine was, perhaps, the great patient project of the medieval monasteries. In the early Middle Ages, the production of wine in much of Western Europe was a haphazard business. Vineyards were planted where the soil seemed agreeable. The grapes were harvested when they looked about ready. The wine was made in much the same way every year. The results were uneven and were generally drunk young because they did not keep well. What changed this, slowly, was the long, careful attention of the great monastic vineyards, and in particular, of one order in one region. The Cistercian order was founded in 1098 at the Abbey of Citeaux in the flat farmland of Burgundy in eastern France. From the beginning, the Cistercians were a strict order, devoted to manual labor and self-sufficiency. They cleared land. They built barns and mills, and they planted vines on the gently sloping hillsides to the east of the abbey. Over the next several centuries, the monks of Citeaux and their daughter houses became some of the most patient and observant wine growers in Europe. They walked their vineyards. They noticed that the wine from one small patch of land tasted quite different from the wine from another small patch, only a few rows away. They noticed that the same patch, vintage after vintage, gave wine of a particular character, heavier or finer or longer lasting. They began, in some accounts, to study the soil very closely indeed, and to draw lines around the patches that gave the best wine. The result, over generations, was the slow mapping of what would later be called the climats of Burgundy. The patchwork of small named vineyards, each yielding its own particular wine, that still defines Burgundian wine growing today. The great walled vineyard of Clos de Vougeot, near the abbey itself, was planted and enclosed by the Cistercians in the 12th century, and remained in their hands until the Revolution. It still stands. The walls still trace the old monastic boundary. A small Renaissance chateau at its center marks the original winemaking buildings. The Cistercians also carried their wine-growing methods across Europe. Daughter houses of Citeaux were founded in what is now Germany, Austria, Hungary, Portugal, and beyond. And many of them planted vineyards that are still famous. On the Rhine, the Abbey of Eberbach, founded in the early 12th century, became one of the largest wine producers in medieval Europe. Its great vaulted wine cellars, still standing today, once held the wine of thousands of acres of vineyards on the slopes above. Just upriver, at the famous estate of Schloss Johannesburg, Benedictine monks had been growing wine since the 12th century. It was here, in the late 18th century, that the practice of late harvest grape picking, which gave the world the rich, sweet wines of the Rhine, is said to have been discovered almost by accident. When a messenger bringing the order to begin the harvest was delayed for several weeks, and the grapes, by the time he arrived, had withered into something unexpectedly fine. The terraced vineyards of the Wachau in Austria were largely shaped by monastic hands. In Portugal, Cistercian monks were among those who planted the early vineyards along the Douro that would, much later, become the source of port. What the monks gave to European wine growing was not so much a recipe as a habit of mind. The long, careful, year-by-year attention to a particular piece of land. The patient setting down in writing of what each year produced. The map of European wine, in its broad outlines, was largely drawn by men in plain robes, walking the same vineyards for centuries. Beyond the famous things, the champagne, the cheese, the beer, the liqueurs, the great wines, the monasteries of Europe were quietly the keepers of a vast amount of ordinary agricultural knowledge. There was, first, the matter of bread. The monastery bakery was a steady central building, and the bread it produced fed everyone. The monks themselves, the lay workers, the guests, the poor at the gate. Many abbeys ran their own mills, driven by water or later by wind, and ground their own flour from grain grown in their own fields. The slow improvement of milling, of bread ovens, of leavens, owed a quiet debt to the steady demand of the monastery refectory. There was the matter of fruit. The monasteries planted orchards on a serious scale. Apples and pears for cider and perry, plums for drying and for spirits, cherries, quinces, medlars, walnuts. Many of the heritage varieties of European fruit, the ones grown today in small numbers by enthusiasts, were first selected and propagated in monastery orchards, where the grafting of trees was a careful art passed down from one gardener to the next. There was the matter of fish. Most abbeys kept fish ponds, often a long chain of them, fed by a stream and stepped down a gentle slope. Carp, trout, pike, tench. The ponds gave Friday meals when meat was forbidden, and the management of them, the cleaning, the stocking, the harvest, was a quiet branch of monastic agricultural science. And there was the matter of the garden. Every abbey had a herb garden, sometimes very large, set within or near the cloister. In it grew the plants for the kitchen: parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary, fennel, and the plants for the infirmary: chamomile, valerian, mint, hyssop, melissa, rue. Many of these had come north with the Romans and might have been lost in the cooler centuries that followed. The monasteries kept them alive, garden by garden, generation after generation. A few of the great medieval garden plans survive. The most famous is a parchment plan drawn in the early 9th century at the Abbey of St. Gall, in what is now Switzerland. An ideal blueprint for a Benedictine monastery, with every building marked, including the herb garden, the kitchen garden, the orchard, and the infirmary garden, each with its beds laid out in neat rectangles. The plan was probably never built exactly as drawn, but it shows very clearly what a well-ordered monastery was meant to be. A small, self-contained agricultural and medical world. It is worth pausing for a moment on one particular nun. In the 12th century, in the Rhineland, a Benedictine abbess named Hildegard of Bingen wrote, among many other things, 2 long books on natural history and medicine. They were called Physica and Causae et Curae. They described in patient detail the qualities and uses of hundreds of plants, animals, stones, and elements known in the gardens and countryside around her abbey. Hildegard's books were not, by modern standards, scientific. They blended folk knowledge, classical learning, and her own observations in a framework of medieval ideas about humors and temperaments. But they preserved an enormous amount of practical herbal knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The uses of fennel for digestion, of chamomile for sleep, of lavender for headache, of nettles in spring, of barley water for the sick. Many of these remedies are still in everyday use today by people who have never heard her name. Her books were copied and recopied through the medieval centuries and read by infirmary brothers and sisters in monasteries all over Europe. They are, in a sense, a single visible peak of a vast, hidden mountain of monastic herbal practice. The daily knowledge of every infirmarian and gardener in every quiet abbey of how to treat a fever, calm a cough, or soothe a sleepless night. The great age of monastic farming did not end all at once. It faded slowly across several centuries. In England, in the 1530s, the king dissolved the monasteries. Hundreds of abbeys were closed in a single generation. The buildings were sold or pulled down. The orchards were broken up. The cheese recipes survived, often because the villagers had already learned them. On the continent, the great change came later. In 1790, the new revolutionary government in France dissolved the religious orders. The vineyards and cellars and dairies of hundreds of French abbeys were sold off. The monks were sent home. The herb gardens were left to the weeds. For a while, much was lost. Then, slowly, in the 19th century, some of it returned. The Trappists came back to France and Belgium and the Netherlands. They refounded their abbeys. They built new dairies and new small breweries. The cheese-making began again. The brewing began again. The Carthusians, expelled more than once and returned more than once, kept their old recipe and made the green liqueur again whenever they could. Today, only a small number of abbeys still make food and drink in any quantity. The Trappist breweries of Belgium, a handful of French monastic dairies, the Carthusians in their valley in the Alps, a few Benedictine houses making honey or cookies or wine. The numbers are small. The methods are slow. The line is unbroken. A glass of chartreuse poured at a dinner table. A wheel of Munster cheese on a market stall in Alsace. A bottle of dark Trappist beer in a Belgian cafe. A jar of honey from a small monastic shop in Provence. A simple round loaf from a tiny bakery near a Norman abbey. All of them, in their different ways, are still threads of the same long, quiet inheritance. Most of the people who pour a glass of champagne tonight, or cut a slice of washed rind cheese, do not know they are tasting the long, quiet work of monks. That is, perhaps, as it should be. The monasteries were not trying to make famous things. They were only trying to feed themselves well and to live a quiet life and to do their work carefully. The cheeses and the bottles and the green liqueur in its tall bottle were simply what the work produced. Year after year, century after century. In a cellar somewhere in France tonight, a row of dark bottles is lying on its side. The wine inside is slowly clearing. The cellar is cool. The lamp by the door is turned low. Just the bottles. Just the cellar. Just the long, slow quiet.